Volume targeted control ventilation. Each breath is mandatory ventilator breath. Flow time scaler indicates a square flow. Pressure time waveform confirms time triggering. Volume time scaler displays a linear increase in the volume delivery. Volume targeted assist control ventilation. Each ventilator breath is triggered by patient. Flow time scaler is similar to control ventilation. Pressure time waveform differentiates a control breath from an assisted breath by the small negative deflection prior to the delivery of the mechanical breath. Volume time scaler shows fixed tidal volume being delivered. Volume targeted SIMV spontaneous breather interposed between mechanical breaths. Flow time graphics demonstrate mechanical breath delivered at a constant flow rate while spontaneous breaths are by lower flows and non-constant flows. Pressure time scaler demonstrates spontaneous breaths and mechanical breaths. Volume time tracing displays smaller volumes delivered during spontaneous component of the SIMV cycle. Pressure targeted assist control ventilation. Each breath is a ventilator breath triggered by the patient. Flow time tracing is consistent with that during control pressure ventilation. Pressure time scaler shows a small negative deflection prior to delivery of a mechanical breath. Volume time tracing is similar to a control breath. Pressure targeted SIMV. All mechanicals breaths are delivered at preselected pressure control breaths assisted with interposed spontaneous breath. Each breath is patient triggered, unless the patient comes apneic. Flow time tracing shows the pressure control breathe with characteristic descending flow pattern. Pressure time patterns show a pressure plateau during mechanical breaths. The spontaneous breaths are identified from the inspiratory pressure below the baseline and expiratory pressure above the baseline. Volume time waveform indicates an increased delivery of volume, a volume plateau and decline at baseline during mechanical breaths. Continuous positive airway pressure (CPAP), a commonly employed mode used to increase functional residual capacity (FRC) in patients demonstrating refractory hypoxemia and patients with sleep apnea. Flow time curve simply indicates inspiratory and expiratory spontaneous flows. Pressure/time is the tracing that identifies the presence of CPAP, which is spontaneous ventilation baseline maintained at a positive pressure. Volume time shows a variable spontaneous volumes. Pressure support ventilation (PSV). This mode augments a spontaneous breath by applying a preselected pressure to deliver a higher volume at a lower patient effort. Flow time waveform is used to recognize a pressure-supported breath. Pressure time tracing indicated a patient-triggered breath. Volume time shows delivered volume which depends on the pressure support level. Volume targeted controlled ventilation with a constant flow. Flow volume loop demonstrates a square waveform pattern during inspiration and exhalation is shown in the bottom part of the loop. Pressure volume loop represents a loop characterized by constant volume delivery. The tracing begins at the zero origin and concludes at the same point. Volume targeted assistant ventilation with a constant flow. Flow volume loop is similar to the control mode loop. Pressure volume loop illustrates patient triggering. The loop begins at zero and when the loop moves to the left of the volume axis this indicates an inspiratory effort was made by the patient. Volume targeted SIMV flow volume loop shows two types of breaths. The smaller, inner loop represents the spontaneous breath whereas the larger loop represents a mechanical breath. Pressure targeted controlled ventilation. The inspiratory flow descends during inspiration to maintain the target pressure until the present inspiratory time elapses. Flow volume loop illustrates a descending inspiratory as well as expiratory flow. Pressure volume loop demonstrates a smaller hysteresis compared to the volume ventilation with constant flow. The descending flow is responsible for the smaller hysteresis of the pressure volume loop. Pressure targeted assisted ventilation flow volume loop shows a tracing similar to control ventilation, a descending pattern in both inspiration and expiration. Pressure volume loop indicates a negative deflection on the pressure axis constant with the trigger effort made by the patient. Pressure targeted SIMV flow volume loop shows two magnitudes. A smaller loop representing a spontaneous breath and larger loop illustrating a mechanical breath. Continuous positive airway pressure (CPAP). Flow volume loop shows some deviation from the zero volume point during exhalation due to a leak in the circuit. At the beginning of inspiration, the flow rate drops momentarily to zero, before completing the inspiration. CPAP is not reflected on the flow volume loop. Pressure volume loop clearly illustrates that the pressure volume tracing originates at the higher pressure and returns nearly to the same point. This pressure variance is indicative of CPAP. Pressure support ventilation (PSV). Flow volume loop illustrates a descending inspiratory flow rate until a system-specific flow is achieved, then the flow rate rapidly decreases to zero. Pressure volume loop illustrates patient triggering. The pressure support breath is delivered with the expiration returning to zero baseline. The loop moves in a clockwise pattern during initial phase, patient triggering, and the counterclockwise for a mechanically delivered pressure support breath.